We're joined by Gerard, Holland, CEO of Page Research Centre. Great to have you here in the studio, Gerard. Where you belong, here in the studio. Last time you were out in the bush somewhere. Now you're back here. Good to have you here. If you were out in the bush or anywhere else in New South Wales, you wouldn't have been able to use a dishwasher. You wouldn't have been able to turn on your air conditioning. Yet again, we learn that renewables somehow or other aren't quite up to the job, Gerard.
Well, and that's exactly right, Rowan. It wouldn't be a surprise to anyone that on Wednesday of this week, we're all told not to use our pool pumps, our dishwashers, our air conditioners, lest the entire grid collapse due to one unscheduled outage out at Eraring power station. Now, the reason for this is simple. We have massively overinvested in renewables. The vast majority, 80% of investment over the last 10 years has gone towards intermittent and unreliable power, and we've underinvested in that baseload capacity in the grid. And since we've taken out 3.5 gigawatts at Liddell, since we've taken out that capacity at Hazelwood, we haven't put new baseload power in, but our reliance on coal hasn't changed. So all of these existing stations, which are ageing, are getting older. They're getting absolutely smashed, being ramped at a much higher capacity because we're asking them to do the job that a more stable grid was doing historically when we had more coal and more baseload power in our grid.
Well, we had that overinvestment in renewables, but at the same time, underinvestment in what actually works at this stage, which is fossil fuels. And our emissions are going up under the Albanese government. This has been a complaint of the Greens. Well, we're paying more, we've got unreliability, and we're not even meeting the emissions cuts. So exactly where is the win on the board here?
Well, this is the frustration, is that we've been promised that renewables would be cheaper and they would be cleaner. And they're evidently not cheaper. We're building lots and lots of diffuse machines that we're only using part of the time that are pushing up those spot prices, particularly in later in the evening when solar and wind aren't producing electricity. But at the same time, they're not cleaner either. Once you factor in the entire lifespan of these installations, how many times you have to replace them, you're only reducing emissions by about 40% than our existing coal fleet. At the same time, you're destroying farmland, you're destroying our national parks, you're having these massive build-outs of industrial plants, but also all the distribution and transmission lines as well. And so they're not better for the environment. They're certainly not cheaper. So you start to wonder, well, how have we even gotten down this path?
James.
And, tell us a bit more about this claim here, because Chris Bowen goes out and he says, no. And he insists, though, that renewables are the cheapest form of energy. And yet we had a spot price hit, I think, $16,000 or $17,000 per megawatt hour at one point this week. At the same time, the Premier here in New South Wales is saying, please don't come home and turn on the air conditioner even though your house is hot because you've been out at work all day. Don't do that, please. There seems to be a lot of fiddling around the numbers. We hear terms like integrated service plan and things like that. Tell us about what's actually happening with these numbers, because it seems to me like Chris Bowen and, frankly, a lot of the energy regulators are being really disingenuous here.
So I think there's two important things happening there, James. The first one is that a system is not a market. So proving that you can produce low-cost energy at a very small fraction of the day does not then mean that over the course of a 24-hour period that you can push prices lower. And that's the first problem, is that because renewables only operate a couple of hours, it comes in those gushes and rushes. It means that you're much more reliant on peaking power, and that traditional cheaper power of baseload, rather than trucking along all day, you're then having to turn it on in demand times when the renewables can't meet that demand. So that's what leads to that fluctuating spot price that you mentioned. But the other important thing to mention is that the integrated system plan is basically marking its own homework. It's assuming that the government's policy position of 80% renewables by 2030 and all of the battery storage, that will happen with no delays. It assumes modelling on prices where most of those best sites, all those gold sites, are already taken, and so they're not factoring in it's going to get more and more expensive to build more onshore wind and solar, especially as you get further out in the grid. And so it's not a fair reflection of the full system cost of producing that electricity.
If they also want to see how government works, you should take them down to the Snowy Mountain. They could go and stand in the tunnel with Florence the Machine and see how effective they are. Sorry, James.
Oh, so I was going to say, but the other thing too that this seems to ignore is that every percentage point of solar and wind that you add in, this makes the grid less reliable, right? I mean, they're saying they want to get to 83%, I think, by 2035. But at that point, you've got to build all sorts of stuff to keep that going, right? And there's no gas, they won't do gas, and they're letting the coal run down.
Absolutely. when you think about your anatomy of a power bill, you've got the wholesale generator, you've then got the system cost, you've got the green levies, which of course we're slapping on to subsidise a lot of these things, and then you've got the retailer slapping on the bit at the end. To keep that wholesale portion of the bill down, you want your cheapest electricity running for 24 hours, so they've got a steady supply of electricity and they know how much they need to put into their system. And then at those different times when you expect more demand, you then want to bring in your peaking power, which is usually gas, which comes in the line. With a solar grid or a renewable grid, and as you've said, the more you put in, it means that during the middle of the day you have this huge rush of electricity with nowhere for it to go. So it either gets wasted or you have to build huge amounts of battery storage or hydro installations, which are enormously expensive, just to capture that excess electricity. All the while, your cheap, stable electricity you've got turned off. And so this is what's creating that fluctuating kind of system.
Rita,
which is so
it's insane. Well, the way you described it, it's insane.
I'm convinced that, I don't know at what point, whether it's 20 years, whether it's 200 years, they will look back at this period and look at what we, hopefully 2 years, and it would be like the periods we look at where they used to burn witches, and we'll go, what went wrong? How could so many people be so idiotic? How could they cause that level of self-harm to a prosperous country? Fast forward 10 years, if we stay on this trajectory, what are we going to be looking like, price-wise, reliability-wise?
So we've already seen over the last 10 years, in real terms, electricity prices go up 60%. And on current trajectory, we're probably looking at another 60 to 70% increases.
Right.
I think the important thing to realise is that, viewers of your show, they would be much more energy and electricity literate than a lot of people are. We don't learn this in school. This isn't currently talked about in most of our mainstream media. And most people are really well-meaning. They trust what the government, they trust what the ABC and other elites in society are telling them. And they want to think that they're doing something that's good for the environment, that's going to be cheaper. And this is where I think we've been failed, is you've got this expertocracy who are marking their own homework, who aren't actually factoring in the full system costs, who are completely shut off to coal or nuclear because of what our politicians have dictated them when they're setting out and making their figures. And so this means that the general public are never actually shown the full picture and not
now,
given an opportunity.
And now under 16-year-olds don't have any access to any alternative information that might lead them to think, oh, hang on, there's something crook going on here. How embarrassing was it for Australia to have Ed Miliband making sense at COP29 and talking about nuclear, and AUKUS and the Americans saying to the Australians, you've got to go nuclear. Why aren't you going nuclear? Obviously, if you're serious about zero emissions, you go nuclear. What will happen there?
So it's embarrassing, but it's also quite concerning. When you think about our security apparatus, and particularly as we're transitioning towards AUKUS, let's be honest, we haven't been making those investments in our own military in a strategic matter. We're relying on the US and we're relying on the Brits to do a lot of that heavy lifting. If we don't get our skates on and begin to set up that regulatory framework to process the nukes when they come here, they're going to leave us behind. And they're going to say, look, Australia, you aren't pulling your weight. You're going to become a second player. And then we're going to be completely stranded. So it's not just for our energy needs that we need to work this nuclear stuff out. It's also for our national security and making sure that we can meet our commitments within AUKUS.
Gerard Holland, always great to have you here on Outsiders. Have a great Chrissy, and we'll see you again in the new year. Thanks so much. That's, of course, Gerard Holland there.